Ericka Taylor Beck, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You are the visionary founder and CEO of Authentic Foundations, 2 decades of corporate leadership, and you found your purpose and expertise in helping leaders develop more emotional intelligence. When
Yes.
did you start to realize that traditional leadership methods were failing?
I, honestly, a while ago, while I was in it, actually, one of the funny stories is when people first asked me to be a manager, I always said no because I had some that were decent, but I just had never seen anybody that was crushing it. And I didn't always feel like maybe I had the right personality type to be a leader based on how I had seen it portrayed. And so, just starting off with that as an example, yeah, but there's definitely some good ways to do it and some ways not to do it. And I've experienced both. And so I really realized, though, in the last few years, just being more on LinkedIn and seeing more exposure to folks talking about their experiences and how frustrating sometimes it can be that I'm like, we're doing it wrong. It's just we're burning people out and we're treating them like employees and not like humans. And there has to be a
Mhm.
better way than what we're doing now.
What is emotional intelligence?
There's 5 different factors to it. So it's self-awareness, it's self-regulation, it's empathy, it's social skills. It's the ability to recognize your own emotions and manage them effectively, but also to recognize other people's emotions. Really, it's the fundamental way to look at it is just being able to control yourself in any situation. If something is an emergency, instead of going into fight or flight, you just get your bearings and be able to handle it. If it's a conflict, sometimes the immediate reaction is to be very emotional and to lash out or to respond. And so being able to control those emotions and not necessarily respond the way that our emotions and our natural body wants to do that. So it's being able to handle situations and handle yourself in any situation, but also to recognize other people's, to be able to sometimes mirror them, but sometimes to help bring them back to where they need to go. So if they're getting amped up, if you amp up, they're going to keep. But if you bring it down and talk lower, then they tend to talk a little lower. So it's being able to control those types of situations or at least have a little bit more impact in them.
It sounds a lot like mirroring and matching
Mhm.
when you're having a conversation, matching that pitch just like you were talking about, and also mirroring, for instance, like body positions and whatnot. Um,
Yes.
I feel like when I think about emotional intelligence, it's never about how to gauge someone else's emotional intelligence and kind of figuring out how to bring about that balancing act where you're helping raise them instead of lowering their energy. How can we go about that?
To help raise them,
Hmm.
and part of that is motivation. So the fifth factor, which I didn't mention, was also motivation. And so part of it is to recognize how people are motivated. Is it intrinsically just because they want to do a good job, or are they motivated externally through reward or recognition? And so that's one way to get them a little bit more bought in or more excited. But sometimes it's just in seeing how they're responding and why they're responding and acting in kind. So part of the way I'm thinking in my head right now is playing chess. So no matter what play they're making, if you're thinking about the next steps and what you need to do, you're not really playing checkers. You're thinking ahead and seeing the whole scene and figuring out, okay, if they're going to go this direction, I need to be prepared to handle that. Or if they escalate, how do I deal with that? So trying to steer the conversation. You're not really controlling it, but it's more of steering and having a little bit more of an impact on it.
How does emotional intelligence play a role in bringing about organizational and success inside of a business?
Oh, it's massive. It's massive. You can have all of the right tools and things in place, but if you're a jerk, you're not going to get your team bought into whatever you're trying to do. Part of emotional intelligence is to get folks excited and get them, on board and in alignment. And if you're just yelling instructions at people and calling the shots and just, I said to do it and that's why you have to do it, you're not going to get the best from your employees. But if you really take time to care about them and invest in them and be a human being and understand that, you know what, today, Chris, maybe you're not on your A game because you've got some stuff going on outside. If you feel like you can come and tell me that, I understand. And I understand that today, maybe you're not going to perform the same way that you normally would. But thanks for letting me know. When you really care about people and make some allowances for them because you know that it's not the normal and you're treating them like a human being because they can't control everything that's happening to them, they're going to want to do more. They're going to be more loyal, they're going to be more engaged, and they're going to want to run through walls for a manager that takes care of them because they want you to be successful and they want to be successful. And so let's all work together versus, man, my manager's a jerk and I'm just trying to get a paycheck. I'm just here to get the bare minimum done. I don't really care if they meet their goals. But when they actually feel like you care about them and they care about you, there's a little bit more reciprocity and there's just more buy-in and engagement from your team.
It almost reminds me of going back to school and you have a kid that comes in and maybe they're not having the best of days at home, but I feel like back then a lot of that was glossed over.
Mhm.
Really checking in to see how that kid was doing. And I feel like that has played a role in today's society growing up.
That makes sense. Yeah, because people, I think it's something that we've been taught is that keep your emotions at home, keep them in check at all times. And so I think there's definitely some generations that are learning this and doing this a little bit more intensely. But it's when you go to work, you are work Erica. And then when you leave work, you leave that there. And then you go home and you're home Erica. And then you don't mix the two. And that's just not how things happen. And for kids, when you think about your favorite teacher, it wasn't the one who was the smartest or it's usually the one that just made you feel good, especially when you're young. It's almost like a second parent in a sense. And so the people who took time to check in on you or to make you feel special or to talk to you and make you feel like you're not just one of 30 or 100 other students, that's the one that stands out. When you talk about who's your favorite teacher, most people have one. And when you think who was your least favorite teacher, like most people have one of those too. And it's usually because they were really mean or harsh or had really unrealistic expectations for kids. And so I think that has played a role where they're used to feeling like I have to step everything down and come to work and just do what I'm here to do. But people like you can't shut it down.
Mm.
It's there. You can pretend like it doesn't exist, but it's bothering you. And so it's going to be a distraction. You might not be as quick to respond or maybe as productive as normal. And so understanding that and being able to recognize those things is really important to accepting the entire employee, the entire person.
What are some of the ways, maybe if you're having a difficult day, that you can work through your feelings, maybe just for that moment to not to say shelve them
Mhm.
and push them down, but examine them and just be able to move past them so you can continue to be at work or be at school. So how do you, analyze that emotion where it's at, put it to the side for now, but come back to it later?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you actually said a couple of things that were really important. And I also want to put a disclaimer out there. When I'm telling you, like, you should feel your feelings and you should be able to express your full self, it's not a free for all. You just don't come in and trauma dump every day at work. Or so if you're feeling sad, you just don't start bawling in the middle of a meeting necessarily. So there's still some basic principles of trying to keep yourself together and collected as a person. But being able to talk about it is definitely helpful. But for some tips, breathing exercises, I think if you took a second to just say lower your shoulders and take a couple deep breaths in through the nose, hold it out through the mouth, like that automatically starts to calm you down a little bit because I don't think people realize sometimes that we sit really tense and hunched and we're waiting for the next thing. And so if you just be in tune with your body and just how am I feeling? Am I feeling tense anywhere? And so doing some deep breath, you can do tapping exercises. I think it's called EFT, emotional freedom technique. So you can do tapping mindfulness, maybe journal, just even on a post-it note, just write it down like I'm really frustrated about blah blah blah. And sometimes just getting it out of your head and acknowledging it, like I'm frustrated or I feel like I've been taken advantage of and I'm livid. And so you write it down and maybe go for a little walk, take 5 minutes to just meditate, just get away from your desk, whatever it might be. But those little things make a huge difference and you should actually start to build them into your day because we can go on autopilot and just got to focus, got to get it done, but something is off. So if you take those time, like you said, to acknowledge it, I'm feeling this feeling. I know that it's not productive for what I'm trying to do right now. I will acknowledge it and work on it later, but just need a second to And you could might if it's in a meeting, maybe just, "Hey, we need to take a quick restroom break, quick breather, just need to get away, walk away, and come back." And usually that's enough to get you back where you need to be so that you can focus and get the task done that's at hand, but you're not shutting it down, you're just pushing it aside and saying, "I'll get to this later." So that was you nailed it with what you asked.
I really like a couple things you said. One of them being we don't realize, how tense we are throughout the days. I'm trying to build my self-awareness, and one thing I constantly realize is tensing the shoulders or
Mhm,
body position. So that's definitely something that I'm always trying to keep an eye on. I would say breathing is very important. I've realized if there are times that I'm upset, I can take a second, and if I take the second to actually think about like how I'm breathing in that current moment, usually
mhm.
each emotional state has a breathing rhythm that's tied to it.
Yes.
And so I found that very interesting. If you're sad, maybe your breath is catching in your throat. And if you can just take some deep breaths and continue to control your breathing, you can push past that. Maybe if you're angry, your breathing is sped up and maybe a little more shallow. And
Mhm.
just little things of that nature that can help you return to that homeostasis. How
Yes.
do you think people can work on building the self awareness?
Like mentioned, just taking a moment to be mindful about doing it. Because again, you get stuck on autopilot. You just are go, got this task done, and you're constantly looking through this, to-do list, and you've got influx of social media, emails, your phone, always some kind of notification or a distraction. But to make sure that you start building in just a 30-second, like you said, just breathing. And sometimes you might not notice the emotion, but you notice the physiological response. So the heart rate, the breathing, my hands are sweaty or my hands are really cold and shaky. Starting to notice my body is responding because sometimes if you can't quite recognize the emotion, you can at least notice what your body is physically doing. And like, why am I clenching my teeth? Like, why am I clenching my jaw or my fists? What's going on? But just making sure that you take a second to just check in with yourself. Like you said, whether it's your body, whether it's your thoughts, and just how am I doing? Honestly, I feel like things are pretty good right now. Great. Like keep moving forward. And if not, acknowledge it. I'm feeling disappointed. I'm feeling angry, whatever. Write it down, do something with it. And if you have time to address it, great. And if you don't, just acknowledge it and set it aside and see how you're doing later on because maybe it's a conversation that needs to be addressed with somebody, but now's not the right time to do it. So it's emotional intelligence, one of the things I love about it is that you can improve it, but you do have to practice. And so if you're not somebody who is used to doing it or necessarily comfortable doing it, you do have to try a little bit and maybe even put it on your calendar, maybe throughout the day to just check in with yourself. Maybe it's just 5 minutes, but putting it on the calendar so that it becomes more of a habit. But there's just some little things to do is just making sure that you are wanting to take those steps.
What would you say for someone who may be struggling to identify the feeling that is causing them the different emotional state?
So there's like emotion wheels, I believe. So you've got like, sad and angry and whatnot, and then they branch off into more detailed, specific. You don't necessarily have to pinpoint the exact emotion, but sometimes the challenge or what you really want to do is get to the root of why. So maybe like I'm upset, and upset can mean sad. It could be angry. It could be different things. You're like, I don't really know why. I just feel upset. But if you think through what's going on and you think about maybe your day or something in the back of your mind, usually you're like, "Oh, it's because this thing happened," or "I'm really anxious because I have this upcoming meeting." Once you recognize it, your body's, "Yeah, that was it." You can almost pinpoint and say, "Oh, yeah, it was that conversation. That's what's causing this unease in my body," or, "Oh, I didn't realize how anxious I was about having to do this big sales pitch this afternoon, but now that I'm aware of it, I'm realizing I'm a little bit nervous." And so you might not be able to recognize the specific emotion, but if you just are aware that something is off, and do some exercises and breathing, but try to think about maybe what's causing it. Sometimes the root is really what you want to find, not necessarily just the emotion.
I heard it explained similarly, and it was usually we start out with a problem that's here, but now we're upset because of something else that occurred with this problem. And we just keep stacking emotions on top of it. And
Mhm.
eventually we're mad about or upset about this action over here originally, but now our emotional state is way over here.
Mhm. Yes, and that's why it's important to recognize and acknowledge them because if not, it does, like I said, you can't, you might feel like you can stuff it down and pretend, but if things start to build and then suddenly someone drops a pen and you start to just freak out and yell at everybody and it's a pen, but it's not a pen. When you really go back and do the work, it was this other thing. And now everything else that this person does is just an extra irritant for you or your tipping point is really tiny at this point. You need to be able to recognize it because if not, it will come up, but at an inopportune time. And so that's why it's really important to try to, like you mentioned, acknowledge it and at least just be like, okay, I know that this is here. And sometimes that's all that matters internally too for yourself to be like, look, I know that this is what's going on and we'll address it later. But right now I need to be able to focus. And sometimes just having that acknowledgement is enough to say, okay, it feels appeased at the moment we can move forward. Because I think part of it is like, you're not acknowledging me. I'm going to get bigger until you do something about it. And then at that point, it's almost too late.
If we were to notice someone else going through those types of situations where it's like that one little thing that kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back,
Yeah.
is there a way that we can check in on them in a way that's not maybe seeming like it's invading their privacy?
Yes, but I think it depends on the person and it depends on the relationship that you have with the person because some people are more open to those conversations and some are not. So I think typically you can say, hey, in that meeting, you seemed really short tempered or whatever it was that you want to say over this situation. But I don't think that situation, like we've talked about this before, and you haven't responded that way. Is everything okay? And sometimes just acknowledging that and saying, is everything okay? Or is there anything that you want to talk about? It opens the door where they might say, like, yeah, everything's fine, or no, I don't want to talk. But at least it opens a door. But sometimes you don't necessarily have to be like, wow, you really handled that poorly. What's going on with you? Because that doesn't really help. But if you say, hey, you seem like you're not quite yourself, is there anything I can do? Anything that you want to share? And that way they're like, okay, maybe I might later, maybe I will now, but you at least put the feelers out and acknowledge. And I think the big thing there is to say, you're not yourself, or I think that you're handling things differently than normal. And I am recognizing that things are off. And that helps people to feel seen because you know what my normal is. And so clearly, if this is something outside of my normal, you've recognized it. And okay, now maybe for me too, there's an acknowledgement of, wow, this has gotten out of hand. And now I'm acting out of character. Maybe I do need to talk about it or address it. I think you can at least just offer in a kind way. Don't, point fingers. But if you ask, I think it opens the door. And depending on the person, they may or may not respond.
Do you think there's a barrier per se of maybe someone who's in a leadership position is addressing a situation like that and maybe that person doesn't want to open up because it's, oh, this is my boss, maybe they just don't have a, I'm not going to say a great relationship, just a normal work type relationship, but maybe that person doesn't want to open up. I guess my question is, how can that person in the leadership position break the ice in a way where they take that boss hat off and they
Mhm.
put on their friend hat?
That's a fantastic question, Chris. So part of it is as the leader, you have to set the tone for the team because if you've never done this yourself, you've never set the example of how to do it, then the employee is going to feel like they're the one that's a little bit maybe weird or doing something wrong or inappropriate for coming in and sharing personal because you've never shared with me. So now I'm going to dump on you. And is that weird or not? So they're going to be unsure of how this dynamic is working. But if you've already done that and said, again, limitations, you don't just come in and share everything in as a leader, you don't just drop all of your thoughts and feelings, but you can be vulnerable and say, look, I've got a lot of stuff going on at home, or I have a sick parent. And so right now I'm a little tired because I've been doing this in the evenings. I might not be as quick to respond. But if you just set the stage that this is okay to be a human, to have human feelings and examples and experiences outside of work, then when you say, "Hey, Chris, I noticed that things maybe you seem a little off. Is everything okay?" Hopefully, you feel comfortable enough to say, Erica, I do. I am a little bit stressed or feeling a little bit burned out right now because of not work, but other stuff. And I didn't realize it was impacting work." So part of it is to set the tone ahead of time. But if you haven't done that and you want to start doing that and you're like, oh, shoot, I have somebody who's got a problem, you could say, hey, look, this is Erica to Chris. This is not director to employee or VP to manager or whatever the roles are. This is just Erica to person. Is everything okay? Is there anything that's going on that you need any help with or anything I can do for you? I'm just noticing that you're not performing the way that you normally do and you're not in trouble, but I'm noticing a pattern and I want to check in and make sure that things are okay and how I can support you. And hopefully from that angle, at least they might not share every detail, but saying, okay, I might be on a path where I'm going to start having an impact on my performance. And then this might be a different conversation. Yes, I can give you the basics. So that's one way to do it is just to say, this is not manager to person, just this is human to human, checking in, noticing behaviors, want to open the door if there's anything that you need to talk about. Or if you have any kind of resources through maybe an HR team, sometimes there's different therapy options and things. I'm drawing a blank on what those terms are called all of a sudden. But if you have any resources for employees, you can definitely offer those as well. So just at least acknowledging it.
On the therapy topic, how important would you say that it is for someone to, of course, we can do self diagnosis. And as I was listening to the School of Life the other day, they were talking about how we can take events and we can look at them from a very logical thinking perspective. But it takes someone like a therapist to look at it from an emotional angle. So, how important would you say it is to have someone seek therapy at some point in their life or career?
That's a tough question because I feel like it's so personal, not like that's private, but it's just very unique to each person's situation. I am a huge advocate for it. I have gone to therapy at different times throughout my life and have a therapist that is like on retainer. If I need her, I can call her and schedule time. So I absolutely think it is very beneficial for folks because it's a third party. They're usually some type of licensed professional who has experience in this. They're not biased, so you don't have to worry about telling it to a spouse or an employer where you feel like this might somehow come back and hurt you in the long run or bite you in the rear end. But I think it really depends on the individual and on what situations they're trying to address. But I definitely would recommend it. It's just hard to say you should or you shouldn't. But I think it's nice to have that in your pocket because typically, again, it's a resource where you can go and talk to a stranger about your deepest feelings and thoughts, and they shouldn't tell anybody else and they weren't going to judge you and they're going to try to help you. So if you do need that, then I strongly recommend it. But it's hard to pinpoint for everybody and say a blanket
Mhm.
statement.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. I think the only thing I've seen is some of those people on the fence that they don't necessarily care about you because
Oh.
you're paying them for their time. So yeah, I do think it really takes the person to realize that they're in a position where it's, hey, something is affecting me and I don't know what. And so I need that outside help to come in and maybe help me address some things that I can't find.
Hmm. What I like too is that you typically can try out a therapist. And so if you go and you meet with somebody and you're like, I just felt like they're just waiting for my paycheck, like me to sign over the money. They weren't really listening. I didn't feel like they were giving anything good. If you don't feel a connection, then you can find another person. And if you're doing it through insurance, there's typically others that are in network and whatnot, and some that offer sliding scales if it's not through insurance. But if you feel like you are not connecting or relating, or that they just really don't care about you individually, there are so many out there. And so many of them really do care genuinely. Maybe some are a little bit more stiff and stern, where maybe it doesn't come out as much of empathy as they have and it feels a little bit more clinical, but there are some that are going to be more personable. And so you just look at reviews and maybe call ahead of time and check and see if you feel like you get a good vibe from them before you meet. But there's definitely a lot out there. If that's something that's holding people back is just like they don't really care about me, then if you are having that situation, look for somebody else because they do care and want to help you figure out what's going on.
What are some of the more common mental roadblocks that you've seen when it comes to someone trying to develop their emotional intelligence?
Self awareness. A lot of people don't realize that they need it. So typically, if you've been doing something for a long time, so you've been a manager for 10 years and you're moving up the chain, I'm doing well so far. Like, why do I need to worry about it now? I've gotten this far without it. I'm good. Or they think I'm doing a great job. I'm leading my team. I'm crushing it. My team loves me. We're hitting our targets. But then you ask the team, and they're like, he's a jerk. We hate working for him, but it's a job. We got to do it. And so there's sometimes just a lack of self awareness that there's room for improvement. And also, I think at a certain stage, there's a little bit of embarrassment. You don't want to say, look, I have to work on my caring about people skills. It feels a little bit maybe silly to some people and soft and fluffy to talk about emotional intelligence. They're like, look, I'm here to get stuff done. Here's my strategy. Here's my plan. Here's how I do. And they don't necessarily think as much about the emotional part. And so, for specifically men, told and raised to not necessarily feel their emotions or express emotions as much, it's hard to tell them, go talk to somebody about emotions. I don't want to do that. And so, getting past, I think, societal expectations and how we've been programmed, and then to say, yeah, maybe I do have room for improvement. I'm not the best leader. That's hard to admit, especially if you've been doing it for a while, to be like, maybe I could benefit from some training here. It's hard to go back and acknowledge that sometimes.
How do you begin to open up? You're starting to develop that self awareness. You're wanting to build some of that emotional intelligence. How do you open up to a partner or a spouse and start having those conversations when it's something that you've never done before?
That's a good question. And again, I think part of it depends on the partner or spouse, how they are communicating. Because if you both have not really ever done it and you start to talk about feelings, they might be like, what is going on? Or are you okay? Are we going to break up soon? So there might be some concerns there. But if they are somebody who is more emotional, they might be really excited about it. But I think you can say, like, I'm working on an emotional intelligence journey because, and it's not for any specific reason. I tend to do it for managers and leaders, but everybody benefits from emotional intelligence. Even if you don't have a job, you don't have a spouse, you're just moving around in the world, you can still benefit from having emotional intelligence. But if you're like, look, I really want to improve it and I want to have better relationships, and so I'm going to practice communicating my feelings more or expressing, or if we have a conversation and normally I might start to yell and we would argue, I might take a 10-second breather and collect my thoughts before I respond. And so if you see that, this is what I'm trying to do. And so I think you can just tell them, here's what I'm working on, here's how I'm going to try to bring it into our relationship, our dynamic. So if you see it, don't be surprised or scared, but this is what I want to work on. And this is something I would maybe like you to work on with me, depending on, again, how they already communicate.
Is there, and I'm sure this has a lot of different variations to it, but a way to, I don't know if leave your problems at the door is the right word, but I'm thinking of the work life balance, not bringing all of your troubles home with you and then bringing those into whoever you're living with at that time, and they have to feel the brunt of what's
Yeah.
going on outside of the home.
So it's a fantastic question again, because typically what we see is that if people are trying to work on their emotional intelligence, they're doing it at work because that's where you are expected to be professional and to be put together and to look like you have everything under control. And then when you go home, you don't necessarily have to be as guarded or as on. And so you feel like, oh, I can just vent all of the things. And what we talked about earlier, which is things stack up and they build on each other. And so you get home and maybe, if you have kids and maybe there's a mess in the house, toys are everywhere, and you just fly off the handle because it's not even the toys, it's just everything that's happened all day. And now you don't have to feel like you need to stifle it down. So we're just going to drop a bomb as soon as you walk in the door. And so one thing that you can do is to practice some of the mindfulness and do some of the breathing and try to control those emotions before they escalate. But one thing that, so I'm married and she's in law enforcement. And so one thing that we do is we'll talk about situations throughout the day, things that have happened at work and for both of us, but it's more just to get them out of your head, off your chest, just be able to talk about them, but don't dwell on them. And the emotions and things that come with it. It's okay. How was your day? Oh man, today was really rough. Here are these things that happened. And you listen. And one thing I like to do as well is like, what's my role in this? Are you telling me this because you just want to vent? Are you telling me this because you want me to help provide a solution? Are you telling me this because you want me to yeah, man, that's really sucks. I'm sorry to hear that. What are you looking for? Because typically a lot of people want to vent and then we want to provide answers and fix it, and that's not what they want. And so it ends up making it a little worse. So understanding, hey, if you just want to vent, I'm going to just listen. And then at the end of that, thanks for talking about it. We'll move forward. But hopefully at that point, by being able to at least address it, it's not bleeding into everything else because you are acknowledging it and I got it off. Thank you for letting me talk about it or for whatever your role was in this. Thanks for doing that. And now I feel like I can let it go and be fine. And so I think that's one way is to just not blow up, but to acknowledge it and say, can I vent to you? Another big thing that's not necessarily just emotional intelligence, but it helps a lot is do you have the emotional capacity or the mental capacity to listen to me vent about something right now? Because sometimes if I had a really crazy day and you had a really crazy day and I come home and I'm like, Chris, blah, and you're like, I can't. I don't even know what you just talked about because I was already overwhelmed and now you want me to handle your stuff too. And it doesn't go well. And so sometimes saying, hey, can I vent to you about some stuff? Are you in a place where I can talk to you about that? And if they're like, look, I don't have it right now, okay, I'm going to journal, I'm going to go do exercise, whatever your outlet is that helps you to express yourself. But if they're like, yeah, no, go for it. I'm feeling good. Go ahead and drop it. Then great. But I think that's one way to show some respect for each other too is to I'm not just going to use you as a dumping ground where I share all of the terrible things and all the terrible emotions that I couldn't talk about all day on you because you should be able to go home and have a positive experience where that's something happy. And if all you do is come in and just dump on each other, it's gonna wear on you after a while. And you're like, I don't this relationship is more pain and more strain than it's good, and then it's worse sometimes, and that's not a good way to handle things.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really catches me is not knowing what role that I'm supposed to play if somebody is venting to me. And I'm guessing it is as simple as just going, okay, hey, do you want me to just listen or are you looking for some kind of feedback? What do you need here? Because I have been in a lot of situations where someone has just decided to tell me their life story or explain some situation. And in most cases, I really have no idea what to do. So I just listen and nod my head. And when they're done, typically they're like, okay, yeah, that's it, moving on. But I think sometimes feedback could be warranted. It is just very difficult for myself
Mhm.
anyway to try and give that feedback.
Yeah, it definitely helps to ask just because I think a lot of times most people just want to be heard. And part of it is like we talked about writing stuff down is just if I'm thinking about it today, it's just cycling in my head, I'm overthinking it. But if I come out and say, hey, this is what's going on in my head, it just somehow manages to get it out and it's not trapped anymore and it doesn't feel like it's building up. So sometimes it's just they just want to release. But and for me, like I'm a fixer. So when people vent, I'm like, "Oh, have you thought about this?" And they're like, "Yeah, of course I thought about that." And you're like, "Oh, my bad." But then sometimes people get upset and they're like, "Why are you snapping at me?" And then it just ends poorly. But say, "Oh, you're right. My bad. I should not have jumped in to fix it. What would you like me to do here?" And sometimes they're like, "Just listen." And you're like, "All right." And so maybe you're just crushing it by just being there and listening and nodding and be like, "What am I doing here?" And you're like, "You're killing it."
So you mentioned journaling, exercising. Are there any other stress relievers that you would recommend to people?
There's so many, and it's really unique to folks, like meditation, music. So like, there's different sound healing, which are like sound or singing bowls sometimes, and so those different frequencies do different things for you, or maybe just music. Sometimes it's people like music that have words, and they want angry music, and they want to scream out with that music, and sometimes they just want maybe some classical that's a little bit more soothing. It could be music, could be dancing. Sometimes people like to move their bodies. It's really a unique to you situation, but those are things I like to go outside and walk. Like being outside in nature is one of my favorite things. So just sometimes getting outside and like grounding. So touching a tree or taking your feet, bare feet in grass and the energy just it helps to neutralize it a little bit. Journaling, coloring, painting, sometimes a creative outlet, or just maybe doing something that you really like. So if you're really into a certain TV show, like sometimes watching a funny TV show that you really enjoy is enough to maybe get you out of your head. But there are so many options. It really just depends on what kind of moves each person.
I imagine that's why rage rooms became a thing.
Yes. Actually, I saw an article recently. Somebody mentioned that they thought that when they created this rage room that most men would come in and want to smash stuff up. They said mostly it's like groups of women coming in and knocking some stuff around, which they thought was really interesting because they thought it was going to be a very different demographic. And so apparently women want to smash some stuff up a little bit more than we thought.
Have you ever been to a rage room yourself?
I have not. And you know what? I don't really get angry very often. If I do, it's very brief. It's 5 or 10 minutes. I'm like, "Ugh," and then it just goes away, or it, like, turns into sadness, like, more of, like, disappointment. So I'm not really not a good rager.
I
Are
think
you?
that's something that I really had to work on was my temperament. I think now that I've really tried to start focusing and honing in on it a little bit more, it is drastically better. But I definitely used to be the person that bottled everything up, and then one day the straw that broke the camel's back, and then I would
Yeah.
just have that meltdown. Um, and I think there were a few different things that we've already talked about that helped me: journaling, just getting the thoughts out on paper, exercising. And I think the funny thing about journaling is we're just recording yourself and speaking it out loud.
Mhm.
Is when you listen to yourself, you realize how silly or how simple some of the things that you're upset about actually sound. And I feel like you can definitely look at that and go, okay, wait a minute, wait a minute. Why is this small thing actually an issue? And it's easier to just identify it.
Yeah, that's a great point, and then it's because usually there's emotions tied up with it in your head. If something, you look at it on paper and it's just this very black and white thing, but when it happens, it's maybe another person tied to it, and then there's a dynamic with that person, and so there's more stuff wrapped into it that makes it feel more complex or more convoluted than it is. But when you write it down, you're like, "Oh, it's just this little thing, like, I can handle that." And you don't have to necessarily even keep the journal. Sometimes I think people are like, "I don't want a diary." It doesn't have to be like that. It could be on a Post-it note. You could write it on paper and throw it in the trash. You can burn it. You could do whatever you want with it. You could record it. You do a little video log for yourself, and if you want to save it, you can save it, but if not, you can delete it. But it's just getting it out is the important part.
Yeah. The thing you said about walking also reminded me of Tony Robbins. He was talking about that when you feel stuck, the best thing to do is just put your body in motion.
Mhm.
uh, do something that moves you forward, whether that's going outside for a walk, changing your scenery, changing your environment, and getting out of that place where you feel stuck so that
Mhm.
you can start making progress in a different way.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and I definitely agree. That's usually when you are like in the shower. So like maybe at the end of the day, you're taking a shower and all of a sudden you have all those thoughts. I always call them like shower thoughts, where you have these really brilliant ideas. It's because your mind isn't focusing so much on something. You're just in the moment, just going through your motions and routine of showering. But that's like your brain suddenly has a chance to make those connections, because if you're trying to force it sometimes too much, it doesn't want to work. But if you take yourself out of the environment, like you said, keep moving your body, just focus on something different. If I'm trying to remember something and I'm thinking, I'm not gonna remember it, but if I walk away and go to the kitchen, I'm gonna be like, "Oh, man, it was tomato. That was what I wanted to say." And you're like, just it don't hit you. So, yeah, just give yourself some space, some grace, walk away, and just do something else for a little bit. And there's different things. One of the things I've really focused on too is time management, and it's not necessarily an inherent emotional intelligence skill, but when you have better management of your time and you're prioritizing, you're not scrambling to get things done and try to squeeze people in and squeeze stuff in. You have more time in there. And so I talk a lot about different techniques to work on time management because I didn't realize that a lot of people really struggle with it and how to get everything done. And so, like delegation, and sometimes it's automation, but sometimes it's just you've got to prioritize the big things. And by doing that, you're freeing up some time to be able to do your one-on-ones or to have your meetings and to have those chances for more emotional intelligence, because if not, you're just scrambling and trying to keep your head above water, and trying to build a rapport is the last thing on your mind. You're just trying to stay afloat and stay alive. So it's time management's a huge piece. And so part of that is to build in some breaks. And one of them actually is called the Pomodoro technique, which is tomato, but where you do 25 minutes of focus work and then 5 minutes of a break, and then 25 minutes of focus work and then five of a break. And the goal is to break it into smaller pieces where you are getting away from your desk and focusing on something different to keep your brain fresh and moving.
I actually love that technique. I have it. So here it is.
You have a timer?
Best,
Yep.
yeah, best thing I ever bought. I don't use it as often as I should, but my weekends are less structured because I'm not at my W-2. And so it definitely helps. I go to my whiteboard. I go, okay, everything that I have to do today, meetings included, everything that is poking at my brain, asking for attention, I just write it on the board and get it in front of me. And then I start selecting task, and I used to sit down with the timer, and before I realized it, I was just knocking things out because I was actually
I
focused
love it.
on one specific thing.
Yes.
So the Pomodoro technique is huge.
I love that you know it and use it, and that's fantastic. But yeah, it is. It's just one, we really are not good at multitasking. I think we like to think that we are, but we are not. And so focusing on one key thing at a time and then giving yourself a break to, like you said, keep your body and your brain in motion and come back and focus on one thing at a time, you just start to get things done. Because if it's a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, like nothing is done. And so if you just make that concerted effort to focus and take breaks, it's a game changer.
Actually, my mentor, one of my favorite exercises that he did to talk about multitasking and how we're just not good at it is he had us write very simple sentence. It was like, Sally has a dog. And we would write Sally has a dog. And then we would have to write two sentences. It's same thing, Sally has a dog, but now you're going to write the sentence twice, but you're going to write S, A, and it
Oh,
takes you
wow.
much longer to write both of them because you're trying to focus on two different tasks. Whereas if you were just writing the one sentence
Interesting.
out, it would just be super quick. And so I think back to that exercise a lot when I'm trying to tell myself that I'm good at multitasking.
Yeah, I think we all want to think that we are, but that's actually really fascinating. And I've done that before, just doodling on stuff, and it does take a lot longer to try to do two things at one time like that. That's a really good example for that. But yeah, it's a human thing. I think we all think that we're great at a lot of stuff, but when you really look at the numbers, you're like, we're not really that great at it. Breaking things into bite-sized chunks and focused time is really helpful for time management.
Circling back to delegation, if someone has just an overwhelming amount of tasks on their plate, how can they learn to delegate effectively?
Oh man, there's a few things that you can do. Uh, I have a lot of thoughts on this. So a couple of things you can do is to see, do you have to be able to do it? Because typically as leaders, we want to think that we are really important and that we have to do all these things. And a lot of times we can give it to somebody else, like somebody else's input is just as good as ours. And so one is to determine what can be delegated to other people. Part of that too is then who should you delegate it to? Because just because someone might have more time, they might not be remotely interested in that task. It might be a bad delegation to give it to them. So people who are excited about it or people who are good at it and have the bandwidth, that's who you'd want to give it to. But then you want to make sure that you're setting them up for success. And so giving them very clear expectations of what you need to do, when you need to have it done, what the deliverables look like, and make sure that they have everything that they need as far as resources and the background and everything, and give them a timeline. And typically, if it's due at a certain point, I try to give them a timeline that's before then so that we can meet to review it before it's done. Because even though I've delegated it, I'm still ultimately responsible for what is being turned in. And so I want to make sure that it's aligned with what we need to do. Part of it is to acknowledge that you can't do everything and that it's okay. And that's, again, I think hard for folks because they want to have that control and that job security. If I'm the one that does this, then I get to stay here forever. But you want to let some stuff go so that you can do higher level things and more important things. And then determine what needs to be delegated, who can be delegated to, and then just make sure that there's some framework as far as what they need to have done. Make sure that you are there for support. Hey, along the way, if you have any questions, feel free to come to me, but I'll check in depending on how long the project is, once a week or a couple times this week, whatever the timeline is. But be available to support them, but then let them go and do it because a lot of folks want to micromanage. And so give them the guidelines, give them the support, be available, but then let them have that free time. And then when they come back with their deliverable on your timeline, then you can review it. And if it's great, give them kudos, give them feedback, positive recognition. And if it's not great, then some feedback around what could they have done differently or how it could have been done better. Or they can give you feedback too. Hey, I didn't feel like you gave me all the details that I needed up front, and I missed a few key things. So it's a chance for you both to give some feedback on how did I delegate and how did you do with the task. But that's one way is to just acknowledge and then prioritize what needs to be owned by you and what does not.
I think it might be a little tough for some people to accept constructive criticism.
Oh, for sure.
Are there any tips that you would have for just woosahing yourself and just being able to sit there with an open mind and go, that actually makes sense. Maybe I should try to work on
Oh man, so much stuff. Chris, I have courses on all of these things that you're asking, and that's why I'm like, I have so many thoughts when you ask, because I'm really excited about them too. But again, part of it comes down to a culture. Do you have a culture where you can give feedback? And if the answer is no, it's going to be really hard for you or for other people to receive constructive feedback because they're not used to getting that. And it also matters how you deliver constructive feedback because there's a bunch of different models. The one that I use the most is situation behavior impact or the SBI model. But if you just say, wow, Chris, you really sucked at that thing I asked you to do yesterday, do it better next time. That's not constructive. That wasn't helpful. I didn't give you any specifics and it just probably made you feel really crappy about yourself. But if I say yesterday in that meeting, so that's the situation, I saw you were on your phone the whole time and distracted. That was the behavior. And the impact, so the I part of that is nobody felt like you were really present and it left a really bad impression on the other teams and the CEO. And so please going forward, make sure that you are present and that you aren't on your phone during a meeting. And so you're giving a structure on how you deliver the feedback. It's objective, it's helpful, it's very specific. Oh, shoot, it was that meeting. And yeah, I was on my phone. But also, here's what's expected for next time. But so as far as the woosah part, it's a little bit harder if whoever's giving you that feedback is delivering it terribly because your immediate response again is that emotional hijacking of like my fight or flight. I want to punch you right now, or I want to cry and go hide because I'm embarrassed. But if you are listening to it and saying, okay, underneath all of that, there were some really valid points. I didn't represent myself very well in that meeting, so I could do better. Thank you for telling me. But if they're coming at it in a really harsh way, then you can give them feedback and say, wow, that feedback, I'm having a hard time taking something constructive away because that was delivered in a way that feeling very emotional about it. I'm having a hard time really processing it because that was harsh. And so feedback within feedback, it's like feedback inception, but it just depends on how it's being delivered. But if you can try to take the breath and process it and say, okay, this is coming from a good place. Typically, it should be coming from a good place. Now, if they're just constantly telling you how terrible you are all the time, like that's not productive. But if it is very much, I know that you've been wanting to make a good impression and get a promotion. This was a really good opportunity and it didn't go well. That's coming from a place of, I want to help you succeed and get promoted. Don't do these things that are going to get in your way. And so it should be coming from a good place in which you can say, I'm a little embarrassed, but thank you for telling me. And maybe I'll talk to the CEO or whatever the case might be. But just thanks for letting me know because I would not have realized that maybe I left a bad impression. So that was a long answer to that, but there's so much you can do to make it better.
that. I think even on the opposite end of that, when you see someone, and this is definitely something that I need to work on myself, when someone does something that you like or that you appreciate,
Yes.
go and tell them that immediately. Don't wait X
Yes.
amount of time. The immediate feedback loop is what helps build that good behavior that you're looking for.
Yes. And that's you've nailed it because I think it's actually sometimes harder for people to give positive feedback because it feels I don't really know what I'm not really sure why, but I think sometimes it feels a little awkward for them to say, "Wow, in that meeting you did really well." I don't know if they feel like that sounds condescending or I don't know, but I feel like if you said, "Wow, in that meeting you really handled yourself well," and when they ask questions, you had great data to back up what you were talking about, fantastic job. It's very specific, but it's again using SBI, but also it's relevant and timely because if you say, "Hey, last week in that meeting, I've been in 50 meetings since last week. Which one?" And so you want to do it in a relevant and timely fashion. But yeah, people want to hear good stuff. They don't want just constructive feedback. Constructive is definitely helpful, but it's really good to hear what you're doing well to be like, do more of that. That's what I want to keep doing is getting more positive kudos.
Yeah, I think personally, at least for me, is that it does feel a little awkward. Maybe just because it's something I haven't done, but it just feels a little awkward, a little out of place. But if someone were to tell me that, I would be overjoyed to hear that. I'd be like, "Yeah,
Right.
small victory, I did it." But it's at the reverse, it's just very difficult for me to do that myself.
Yeah,
Um,
you could do it in a way that's a little bit more comfortable too. So you don't have to be like using the framework where the situation was, where it's so stiff, but you can be like, man, really good job in that meeting. The way you handled yourself was really impressive. It could be something as simple as that. It depends on how you communicate with folks. I tend to be, this is how I am all the time at home, at work, whatever. I'm very casual and myself. So I would be like, you did a really great job. And I was really impressed with how you handled the questions that they threw at you. And it doesn't have to feel like it's a big production where I'm like, "In the meeting, you did." It's just very casual, and it's something that's simple, and if they're like, "Oh, can you give me an example?" And then you can say, "Yeah, when they asked you this." So you can always elaborate on it, but I think you can do it in a way that feels a little bit more comfortable and authentic, so it doesn't feel like you're being overly. Because I think sometimes it feels like cheesy is the word that's coming to mind, where you feel a little bit dorky to say, "You did a really good job in your meeting," and they're like, "Thanks, I'm doing my job," but you're like, "But I wanna give you some shout outs every now and then in a way that doesn't feel awkward and not genuine, because I want it to feel genuine, and that's because people will feel like, "Keep up the good work," and I'm like, "You don't even know what I do here." Like, that's so you wanna make sure you do something specific. "Thank you. You saw me. I know that you recognize that I did something awesome. That's really cool, and I'm overjoyed that you did that."
and naming the specific instead of being general with the accolade.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, if you're like, "You did a good job yesterday," and you're like, "Cool. At what point during my 8 hours?" And you're like, "The whole day? Was it just a stellar day?" And you're like, in that." So, yeah, being specific really helps to pinpoint what it is that you want to see. And it's a win because they walk out feeling really good, but now they're gonna keep doing that, and so that's gonna help you or your team because 'cause they're like, "Okay, I wanna keep doing these good things because that's when I get positive feedback." So it's a win for both sides.
What do you think has been one of the emotional pieces that's taken you the longest to learn?
Oh, man, that's a good question. I feel like I've actually been pretty decent with the emotional parts. I have always had a high sense of self-awareness, so I feel pretty solid about the emotional parts, but I've struggled a lot with the delegation pieces and the control pieces and wanting to keep everything to myself. Like, that was something that I really struggled with, or coming in and trying to clean it up at the end instead of really giving the right feedback. That was hard. I think the biggest probably mistake that I've made in my career was keeping certain employees longer than I should have. I wanted to give them more chances because I was trying to be empathetic and understand their full circumstances. I was a little bit more lenient in areas where I shouldn't have been. I should have followed my own structure and my guidelines to say, look, this is not acceptable. It's not like a one strike, you're out kind of thing, but I gave them a lot more than three strikes. And ultimately, what that does is create a toxic environment for other people because they're like, this person's not being held accountable and I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do and they're still here and we're making the same money. So it ends up creating this environment that's not good. So I think that was probably the emotional part was having to fire people and trust my gut that it was a valid reason to fire people. I think I gave people too many chances because I wasn't trusting myself enough in those situations.
I definitely think that can be hard. Not that I've been put in that position, but in business and kind of everything we do, team cohesion is everything.
Massive.
You want to make everybody feel included, but you also don't want to have somebody who's not doing their share because no one's going to be happy about that.
Yeah, and you end up upsetting your strong performers when you do that. When you tolerate the low performers or the people who have bad attitudes, you start to see your top performers leave. And so you're doing a disservice to the individual, to yourself, but also to the rest of your team, because it creates such a negative environment for folks to see somebody else get same recognition, same opportunities, and they're doing less work or whatever the case might be. To create a good environment, you do have to find that right balance.
Are there any books or podcasts that you would recommend people listen to increase their self-awareness or emotional intelligence?
Actually, I believe it's Emotional Intelligence 2.0, I think is one of the books that's out there. But I'm going to be really honest, I have not read any leadership books for the past several years. I read a ton at one point, and I've read some really good ones. One, Radical Candors. I have learned that a lot of the books that are out there, here's how you do this. And the way I view leadership is that here's a good framework. How do you twist it and make it your own? Because I think sometimes the books are very much, if you do A to Z, this is how you can be successful. And sometimes trying to fit yourself in that box, it doesn't work as well as it should. And so I have not been reading as many leadership books in recent years. So I hate that it's a terrible answer for folks, but no, I don't have anything I would really recommend off the top of my head.
Emotional Intelligence 2.0.
Go with, because you take the assessment, you look, see where you are with your emotional intelligence and how you can improve it. And it is very helpful, actually.
Ericka, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I'm so glad that I could have some of your time tonight. Where can people go to check out what you're doing and keep up with you?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn. So it's Ericka R as in Romeo. That's not my middle name, but R Taylor Beck. And then I have a website for Podia. So it's authenticfoundations.podia.com. And that's where all of my courses and coaching services and just some other information would be if people need it.
Fantastic. I will definitely make sure that I get those in the show notes. But guys, if you found this valuable tonight, please comment, do all the things, share it with a friend. A lot of people need to hear this, whether they know it or not.
Help their
Uh,
self-awareness.
Self-awareness, most definitely. But Ericka, thanks again for coming on. And
Yeah,
yeah,
thanks
this
for
was
having
great
me. I
fun.
appreciate it. It was a good conversation.